At the launch site in Central Asia, final preparations for the shuttle's blast-off were underway. Experts predicted the Buran spacecraft would be launched within days. It looks remarkably like the American shuttle, but the Soviets insist it's more powerful. The development of the shuttle has been cloaked in secrecy. Its giant booster rockets can lift a load of 100 tons into outer space, more than enough to pack a military surveillance satellite into orbit. So far, it's not been revealed if the shuttle will be manned. It was moved to the launch site on a special shuttle transporter of high security. If the launch goes well, it'll big boost the Soviet space program, but it's still not certain when liftoff be.
Я подчеркиваю, это рассказ о испытаниях новой системы. Вы видите ракету-носитель «Энергия» и космический корабль многоразового использования «Буран». Всего несколько дней они на старте, а за это время сотни людей из десятков городов страны уже работали здесь. Сейчас идут комплексные испытания, описано в технической документации. А в кабинетах и цехах говорят: мы ждем, когда машина дышит. От мысли от линии на рычаже до машины в металле, до ее дыхания около 10 лет. А вот эти кадры мы снимали совсем недавно, когда вся универсальная ракетно-космическая транспортная система была собрана в единый пакет. Пожалуй, только здесь, в монтажно-заправочном корпусе, можно совсем близко подойти к этой связке и даже попробовать взглянуть в кабину пилотов. Именно отсюда вывозится на старт вся система, а в момент старта от нее оторвется масса около 2400 тонн. 4 повоза, каждый по 1000 лошадиных сил, кажутся игрушечными рядом с установщиком. Посмотрите. Во время вывоза вокруг было не более сотни людей. А работает программой более 1000 залов, КБ, институтов, все республики, вся страна. Даже из космоса, с орбиты видна такая связка. Дорога к старту уже знакома. На макетах отрабатывали эту операцию, тренировались, учились люди, проверяли технику.
Сегодня ранним утром начинался вывоз ракет-носителя «Энергия» пристыкованным орбитальным кораблем «Буран» на старт. И вот сейчас уже сумерки опустились на космодром Байконур, и здесь в степи загорелось огромное светлое пятно. Здесь ночи не бывает. Здесь на этой стартовой позиции всегда будет день, потому что круглые сутки будет светло, будет освещаться стартовая позиция, и круглые сутки будут вестись работы.
Испытаний и энергии, и орбитального
The Soviet shuttle bears a striking resemblance to its American counterpart, even down to the heat tiles, and has even been plagued by similar delays to those which hit the first U.S. shuttle mission. Now, the go-ahead has been given for the giant Energia rocket to blast the shuttle into space. It will be an unmanned flight. The Soviets are cautious about pilot missions, especially after America's disaster. A flight with 2 cosmonauts will come later. If successful, the shuttle, which is called Buran, or Snowstorm, will become the first reusable launch vehicle to compete with the United States. Its 6-year development has been shrouded in secrecy. It was only last month that the Soviet Union released photographs of the vehicle.
Напомню вам, это первому полету орбитальный корабль «Буран». Конструкторских испытаний и энергии, и орбитального для многоразового использования «Буран». Назначен день старта, 29 октября. День, когда подтвердятся или опровергнутся уверенность, надежды и опасения. Сегодня завершились последние комплексные испытания, и пока в лабораториях расшифровываются пленки, в кабинетах взвешивается каждое слово, на старте по-деловому, не спеша, убирают, как здесь говорят, красноту, снимают заглушки, приборы, которые не должны оторваться от Земли во время старта всей системы. Конструкторских испытаний и энергии, и орбитального корабля многоразового испытания «Буран». Назначен день старта. На старте по-деловому, не спеша, убирают, здесь говорят, красноту, снимают заглушки, приборы, которые не должны оторваться от Земли во время старта всей системы. А вот эти кадры уже Ника. Мы снимали, когда и «Энергия», и «Буран» стояли еще в стапелях на монтаже. Интересны принципы, по которым организована здесь работа, но еще интереснее люди, создавшие эти принципы. Придет время, и мы назовем их, покажем, а пока рядом орбитальный корабль «Буран», что только ранним утром освещается, а не солнцем. Сейчас уже день заканчивается, солнце на закате. Заканчивается день необычный, потому что именно сегодня была объявлена дата и время старта всей системы. Напомню вам, это к первому полету орбитальный корабль «Буран».
Добрый вечер.
Сегодня завершились последние комплексные испытания, и пока в лабораториях расшифровываются пленки, в кабинет вешивается каждое слово, на старте по-деловому, не спеша, убирают, как здесь говорят, красоту, снимают заглушки, приборы, которые не должны оторваться от Земли во время старта всей системы. А вот эти кадры уже хроника. Мы снимали их, когда и «Энергия», и «Буран» стояли еще в стапелях на монтаже. Интересны принципы, по которым организована здесь работа, но еще интереснее люди, создавшие эти принципы. Придет время, и мы назовем их, покажем, а пока рядом с современной техникой суеверие. Мы не привыкли рассказывать о деле, которое еще не сделано, говорят здесь. Рассказывайте сами. Сейчас мы находимся в корпусе, в котором лежат так называемые технологические макеты. Это и технологический макет носителя «Энергия», и технологические макеты первой ступени. Эти макеты сейчас подвергаются очень подробному техническому детальному анализу, потому что на этих макетах отрабатывались операции, сложнейшие операции по запуску ракетного носителя «Энергия» топливом, многие операции, которые проверяли работу двигателей. Сейчас идет огромная исследовательская работа, где анализируются изменения, которые произошли в тех или иных системах материалов. Развитие ракетной космической техники невозможно без качества, а качество здесь закладывается еще на уровне проекта. Каждый штрих на чертеже, каждая гайка, каждый, попросту говоря, болт, он многократно будет испытан на стендах. Заложено в проектную документацию даже параметры материала, из которого должен сделать. Но как эта техника будет собранная вся вместе, на новом, еще не опробованном стартовом столе и в полете, в этом цель нынешней работы. Так расположены на стартовом столе универсальная ракетно-космическая транспортная система «Энергия» и пристыкованный к ней орбитальный корабль «Буран», что только ранним утром освещается, а не солнцем. Сейчас уже день заканчивается, солнце на закате. Заканчивается день необычный, потому что именно сегодня объявлена дата и время старта всей системы. Напомню вам, это 29 октября, 6 часов 23 минуты по московскому времени. Время, возможно, будет меняться, потому что продолжаются испытания, а испытания предполагают передвижку времени. Итак, 29-го старт, а завтра мы расскажем вам, как готовился к космическому полету, к своему первому полету, орбитальный корабль «Буран».
По договору, заключенному...
Over the weekend, Soviet television broadcast pictures of the shuttle named Buran, or Russian for snowstorm, mounted on the Energia booster rocket, which will lift it into space. The announcement said the early morning launch would be broadcast live on Soviet television.
Countdown for their first space launch. Liftoff of the unmanned shuttle scheduled for around 11:30 tomorrow evening Eastern Time. That would be around 30 a.m. at the launch site at the Baikonur shuttle facility. According to the Soviet news agency TASS, fueling of the spacecraft was to begin today. The Soviet launch comes just a month after the Discovery mission. Western diplomats say the Soviets wanted to send up their shuttle before the Discovery flight, but they had problems with onboard computers.
A lot of people at home are saying, that looks familiar.
Very.
It's a lot smaller and a little different. It's 18 minutes past the hour.
Let's join Valerie Voss. The space shuttle liftoff is scheduled for Saturday Moscow time. The first flight will be unmanned. The Soviets have long maintained that the United States shuttle program was not sound economically or technologically. But they changed their minds, and it's believed they'll use the shuttle for servicing space stations and satellites.
The Soviet Union says the first launch and landing of a new space shuttle will be broadcast live on Soviet television. The unmanned shuttle Buran is scheduled for liftoff in a little than 24 hours. Soviet officials have refused to say how long the flight will last. Live broadcasts of Soviet space launches are uncommon. The first was in 1986, amid growing confidence in the Soviet space program and the advent of openness under Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. CNN will carry the Soviet broadcast of the shuttle launch live.
Preparations are made in the Soviet Union today for the first launch of a full-scale Soviet space shuttle. The Soviet shuttle Buran looks similar to the U.S. version, but this flight is unmanned, officials say, to avoid any danger to cosmonauts. The shuttle is scheduled to lift off from Soviet Central Asia approximately 14 hours from now. CNN is working to do live coverage of the launch, which is set to start at 11:23 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 8:23 tonight Pacific.
We are told all systems are go for the launch later today of the Soviet space shuttle. The first mission of the shuttle, named Buran, or Snowstorm, is to be unmanned and last about 4 hours. The shuttle is scheduled to orbit the Earth twice before returning from space via an automatic guidance system. The launch is set for 11:23 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. CNN is trying to arrange live coverage, and we hope to bring it to you then.
Scale reusable Soviet space shuttle. The flight of the unmanned shuttle is scheduled for liftoff just before midnight Eastern Time. The shuttle, called Buran, and its Energia booster rocket are undergoing final checks today. CNN's Steve Hurst has more from Moscow.
The Soviet shuttlecraft fastened to the back of the giant Energia booster rocket, glistening in the sun on the launch pad in Soviet Central Asia. Quiet moments of fueling before it blasts into space. The launch scheduled for about dawn Moscow time Saturday morning, a delay of nearly 2 days from previously planned liftoff, Soviet sources have told CNN. The reusable craft named Buran, that's Russian for snowstorm, looks remarkably like its American counterpart. The Soviets say it isn't a copy. The resemblance, they say, is a result of aerodynamic reality, not plagiarism. This first flight of the Buran will be unmanned, computer-driven for several orbits with a runway landing expected the same day. The Soviets wanted to see the Buran in flight before chancing a manned flight and a disaster similar to the Talon catastrophe. The Soviets are masters of manned spaceflight with a nearly continual presence in space aboard the orbiting Mir station. But when the Buran lifts off Saturday morning, the Soviets will be trying to close a more than 7-year gap since the first U.S. shuttle Columbia was fired aloft. Steve Hurst, CNN, Moscow.
Although the Soviet shuttle looks a great deal like its American counterpart, there are some major differences. The U.S. shuttle was never equipped for unmanned flight. The Soviet shuttle engines are on the Energia booster rocket and are detachable, while the U.S. shuttle has large permanent engines. The Soviet uses liquid fuel booster rockets, while the U.S. shuttle uses solid fuel boosters. CNN hopes to bring you coverage of the Soviet launch at 11:23 tonight, Eastern Time.
I'm Bernard Shaw in Washington. Have more on that, but first, Ralph Wing is in Atlanta with our top story. The first full-scale space shuttle, the craft called the Buran, which means snowstorm, is expected to make 2 full orbits around the Earth before landing at its site in Soviet Central Asia. This test flight will not be manned. The Soviet news agency TASS, a countdown, is on schedule and proceeding smoothly.
Full-scale launch of the Soviet space shuttle. The spacecraft is scheduled for liftoff at 11:23 Eastern Time tonight. If Soviet television keeps the launch as planned, CNN will bring you live coverage of that event. With more on the Soviet shuttle's maiden voyage, here's CNN's Steve Hurst in Moscow.
Soviet television showed the space shuttle Buran gleaming in the sun at its Central Asian launch pad, just hours away from its maiden unmanned launch. As final checks were being made, the workers who had taken part in the preparations heard speeches thanking them for their work and wishes for a successful first liftoff at about on Saturday morning Moscow time. The reusable craft named Buran, Russian for snowstorm, looks remarkably like its American counterpart. But the Soviets say aerodynamics dictated the design. Soviet news reports claim the Soviet craft is far more versatile than its American predecessors. As the launch time approached, Soviet authorities backed down from earlier promises to broadcast the liftoff live at 6:20 a.m. Moscow time. The latest word from television authorities is the recorded launch will be shown to Soviet viewers about 35 minutes later. The Buran is to orbit the Earth twice under computer guidance before touching down 8 miles from the launch pad. Soviet television sources said they expected to provide the world with pictures of the landing, but not as it occurs. The Soviets are masters of manned flight with a nearly continual presence in space recently aboard the orbiting Mir station. But when the Buran lifts off, the Soviets will be trying to close a more than 7-year gap since the first U.S. shuttle Columbia was lofted into orbit. Steve Hurst, CNN, Moscow.
An unmanned space shuttle. Second, live coverage of the blast-off on set television. The countdown has begun for the maiden voyage of the Shuttle Buran, meaning snowstorm. A Foreign Ministry spokesman says the landing will also be shown on live TV. The Supreme Soviet concludes its
и природой, потому что люди уже много дней напряжены, собраны. И это напряжение, нагрузка, ответственность за происходящее чувствуется в каждом участнике летно-конструкторских испытаний. Но как бы новой ни была работа, традиции чтятся и выполняются. Сегодня утром все участники работы собрались вместе, и к ним обратился председатель Государственной комиссии по летно-конструкторским испытаниям и пуску универсальной ракетно-космической транспортной системы «Энергия» и орбитального корабля «Буран» Виталий Владимирович Дрыев.
И сегодня Государственная комиссия доверяет вам проведение запуска и пуска изделия. Главное все-таки всегда было и остается качество. И от имени Государственной комиссии я вас очень прошу, Я вас умоляю, качество и только качество. Нам нужна качественная работа и качественный результат. Я даже не буду желать вам успехов в таких ситуациях. Это прорыв, переход количества в качество, это прорыв в новый этап освоения космического пространства.
Нам сегодня повезло. Мы были участниками последнего осмотра испытателями ракетно-космической системы. Все красные заглушки убраны, фермы, выполнившие свои задачи, отведены. Проверяется люк, осматривается каждый узел. Мы были последними людьми у ракетоносителя и орбитального корабля. А они без всего лишнего оказались очень красивыми. Посмотрите. Больше никто не придет сегодня на стартовую позицию. Система спутников готова принимать телеметрическую информацию. Осталась одна ночь. Старт назначен на 6 часов 23 минуты 46 секунд по московскому времени.
Data shuttle liftoff remaining, all systems were go at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Soviet Central Asia. Fueling of the reusable Buran orbiter and its was in geostationary orbit 22,000 miles above the Atlantic Ocean. 60 minutes after takeoff, the rocket reached orbit, and 3 minutes later, Ariane released the satellite and its little panels to start collecting and storing power. The French broadcasting industry designed the system to reach the potential audience of 466 million French-speaking peoples in Europe and North Africa. With only one data shuttle lift remaining, all systems were go at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, Soviet Central Asia. Fueling of the reusable Buran orbiter and its 196-foot booster proceeded smoothly, and the atmosphere was confident. Workers of the Glabkosmos Commercial Space Agency stood proudly as the Defense Ministry's spaceflight official, Alexander Makasamov, praised their efforts. Saturday's maiden shuttle flight, he said, will be as historically significant as the Soviet first space satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. The craft, which has been costed by the Soviet media at $10 billion, underwent extensive checking in preparation for the unmanned flight. Countdown continued on schedule. However, in a turn against recent Soviet space confidence and the advent of Cosmos, the Soviet government may decide not to go ahead with live transmission of the launch. The shuttle has a power capacity to lift craft 4 times the weight of the American shuttle into space.
Tonight, the Soviets will take a giant new leap into space with an unmanned test launch of their new space shuttle. And as NBC science correspondent Robert Zell reports now, any similarities between the Soviet shuttle and its American counterpart are absolutely not coincidental.
At first glance, the Soviet shuttle looks identical to the American version. This is especially so for the orbiter, the vehicle which circles the Earth and returns for landing. American officials say this is no coincidence. The Soviets were able to obtain detailed plans for the American shuttle.
The Soviets look at proven Western design technology. They look at the available open sources in the West, and they scoop it up.
Many of the details of the American shuttle were in unclassified computer files. U.S. government documents, the Soviets got them through this science institute in Vienna, where the U.S., the Soviet Union, and 15 other countries share computer facilities. Some people say it was a mistake to leave so many of the shuttle plans unclassified.
It makes no sense for me to imagine why the American taxpayer has to be indirectly subsidizing the Soviet shuttle plan.
But the Soviets did not copy everything. None of the rockets are on the Soviet orbiter. The Soviet shuttle will be lifted by a separate liquid fuel rocket system called Energia, which can carry other heavy objects into space.
It's the outline of the orbiter, which is the clear-cut carbon copy. Other aspects of the system appear to be homegrown. We can't overlook the fact the Soviets are first-rate, we have world-class rocket engineers.
American experts do not know what, if anything, the Soviets have decided to do with their shuttle.
It may well be that the Soviets saw that we had one, and they decided they had to have one too, whatever it cost, to keep up with the Joneses' orbit. And then they wound up with a orbital white elephant.
Since the launch of Sputnik in 1957, Soviet space hardware has evolved slowly, steadily, and successfully. The shuttle launch will be the newest and riskiest venture the Soviets have undertaken since the beginnings of their space program, and it will use some copied American technology. Robert Bazell, NBC News, New York.
There for that launch, scheduled to lift off just before 11:30 Eastern Time tonight. The unmanned flight is the first full-scale space shot for the Soviet shuttle. Moscow television says the flight will last approximately 4 hours, and Soviet officials already are calling it a breakthrough for their space program. The shuttle is scheduled to make an airplane-style landing on a runway just 7.5 miles from the launch site. Your network of record will bring you up-to-the-minute pictures with live reports from Moscow, beginning at approximately 11:23 Eastern Time, 8:23 Pacific.
Now, CNN Steve Hurst reports from Moscow.
Soviet television showed the space shuttle Buran gleaming in the sun on its Central Asian launch pad, just hours away from its maiden unmanned launch. As final checks were being made, the workers who had taken part in the preparations heard speeches thanking them for their work and wished a successful first liftoff at about dawn Saturday morning Moscow time. The reusable craft named Buran, Russian for snowstorm, looks remarkably like its American counterpart. But the Soviets say aerodynamics dictated the design. Soviet news reports claim the craft is far more versatile than its American predecessors. As the launch time of Soviet authorities backed down from earlier promises to broadcast the liftoff live at 6:23 a.m. Moscow time. The latest word from television authorities is the recorded launch will be shown to Soviet viewers about 35 minutes later. The Buran is slated to orbit twice under computer guidance before touching down 8 miles from the launch pad. Soviet television sources they expected to provide the world's pictures of the landing, but not as it occurs. The Soviets are masters of manned spaceflight, with a nearly continual presence in space recently aboard the orbiting Mir station. But when the Buran lifts off, the Soviets will be trying to close a more than 7-year gap since the first U.S. shuttle Columbia was lofted into orbit. Steve Hurst, CNN, Moscow.
As you probably noticed, the Soviet and U.S. space shuttles look a lot alike, but they are built and operate differently, as a brief point-by-point comparison reveals.
As seen here on the left, the Soviet shuttle has 4 liquid-fueled strap-on boosters. The U.S. shuttle on the right is equipped with 2 rocket boosters. They are solid-fueled. Most experts rate liquid-fueled safer, because rockets powered that way can be shut down after ignition but before launch. Another difference. The Soviet shuttle has no main engines. It depends on its giant Energia booster rocket to ride into orbit. The U.S. shuttle, on the other hand, has 3 main engines. They power it up once the SRBs have dropped away. A third point of difference. The Soviet shuttle does not have orbital maneuvering engine pods. The U.S. spacecraft has 2. They are mounted on either side of the shuttle's tail fin.
Finally, since the Soviet shuttle is being launched without a crew, it is equipped with a fully automatic landing system. U.S. shuttle landings are a joint effort between astronauts and ground control. There is an automatic landing system aboard, but it has never been used all the way through landing. The launch of the Soviet space shuttle is scheduled to take place at 11:23 Eastern Time tonight. If Soviet authorities change their plans and allow it, CNN will have live coverage of the blastoff. If not, we will bring you pictures of the launch soon as it become available.
The 2 whales that were trapped in ice. First full space shuttle apparently is delayed. Liftoff of the unmanned spacecraft had been scheduled for about 11:30 Eastern tonight. United Press International, citing Radio Moscow, reports that the launch is postponed for 4 hours. The Shuttle Buran, Russian for snowstorm, is slated for 2 full orbits, a total flight of 4 hours. Well, earlier Friday, Soviet scientists compared the shuttle launch in importance.
The Shuttle Buran, or snowstorm, is poised to blast off on the back of a huge booster rocket. But Radio Moscow announced the liftoff set for 11:23 Eastern Time Friday night was being postponed for unspecified technical reasons. The shuttle is slated to orbit the Earth twice and then make an automatic landing about 4 hours later back at the launch center in Soviet Central Asia. The Soviet news agency TASS says a new date and time will be announced.
The service platform wasn't pulled back quickly enough. If the launch had gone ahead, the rocket would almost certainly have hit the platform. In the words of the head of the Baikonur Space Center, a catastrophe was avoided.
The shuttle was a minute short of blastoff when Soviet computers stopped the countdown. The scientists at Baikonur first delayed the launch for 4 hours and then postponed it indefinitely. TASS says one of the launch systems showed irregularities, and work is now underway to put it right. Soviet reports have stressed the complexity of the launch systems, saying they require the same amount of electricity as a large system. Rectifying electrical faults near a rocket loaded with 2,000 tons of highly inflammable fuel will require extreme caution, and the best estimate is that the rocket won't be ready for another launch for several days.
времени должен был состояться старт универсальной ракетной космической транспортной системы «Энергия» и орбитального корабля «Буран». Эти кадры мы снимали в командном пункте предстартовой подготовки и запуска. Точно по графику начались работы по заправке. Все операции прошли в соответствии с программой. А когда до момента отрыва ракеты от стартового стола осталось всего 51 секунда, на табло загорелась команда АПП – автоматическое прекращение подготовкой. Процесс управления прекратился. Вот ведь как случается. Вчера мы последними вместе с испытателем космодрома покинули старт, а сегодня первыми приехали для того, чтобы снять вот эти кадры, показать зрителям, что ничего чрезвычайного на стартовом столе ни с Бураном, ни с энергией не произошло. В положенное время.
Система безопасности ракеты-носителя сформировала сигнал о прекращении предстарта и подготовки. Это была вызвана неисправность в одной из систем. Перед вами машина находится, видите, она находится в безопасном состоянии. Сейчас производится слив компонентов топлива, в частности водорода, кислорода, как из двигателя установки орбитального корабля, так и из ракеты-носителя. В целом ракета безопасна, она продолжает находиться на пусковом устройстве и может быть в любой момент подготовлена к последующему запуску. Однако, в связи с тем, что неисправность системы все-таки была, необходимо сейчас проанализировать этот отказ, разобраться в причинах, принять меры, исключающие дальнейший подобный отказ, и приступить к дальнейшей проверке. Мы и при подготовке изделия предполагали или предполагаем в любом случае такое состояние, когда работа может быть и не выполнена. Техника, она достаточно сложная, и поэтому не исключены такие отказы, неисправности. На этот случай разработаны соответствующие документы, которые обеспечивают проведение работы также по законам управления и так называемым алгоритмам приведения комплекса и ракет-носителя орбитального корабля в безопасном состоянии. Вот этим мы занимаемся. Проанализируя причины, приступим к дальнейшей подготовке.
Ну, дайте.
Good evening. The Russian space shuttle is stopped from taking off during the last minute of countdown, but the experts say they know what went wrong. The National Trust has voted the space shuttle was less than a minute away from potential disaster when the launching was cancelled this morning. 51 seconds before the unmanned craft was due to blast off, computers discovered that a service tree hadn't pulled away from the launcher rocket. If the launch had gone ahead, the rocket with 2,000 tons of fuel would have hit the gantry. Soviet scientists hope to sort out the problem and announce a new launching date before long.
The countdown reached 51 seconds and the gantries were swinging away from the Energia rocket when the computers aboard the launch. Sensors detected that one of the towers had failed to clear the rocket properly. Soviet scientists first postponed and then delayed the unmanned flight indefinitely, but they say it shouldn't take long to correct the problem. Major General Gudilin told Soviet reporters that it was a mechanical fault and the computers had prevented the rocket, loaded with 2,000 tons of liquid fuel, catching on the gantry. It's been a troublesome few months for the Soviet space program. A probe launched towards Mars in July stopped responding to radio signals and is now lost. In September, a manned flight got back only after being stuck in orbit for 24 hours, when a series of faults prevented an accurate re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. The two cosmonauts had been stranded with no and dwindling air supplies. Their plight highlighted the need for better space vehicles and the problems of developing them. The Soviet space program and its extensive experience of manned flight has been built on the back of old-fashioned but well-tested rockets and space capsules. The shuttle is far more complex and intended to bring their technology abreast of Americans. But its development is proving more difficult than expected, and they say before they try again, they wanted to...
Словно хрустальные уже парили в воздухе. Но это уже хроника. В эту ночь была назначена первая дата старта летных испытаний. С тех пор, всего за 2 недели, старт-толл покрылся снегом, на нем следы сотен людей, которые вновь взвешивали каждое движение, пытались понять, что же произошло за несколько десятков секунд до подъема энергии и Бурана.
Сейчас на космодроме в течение этих дней проведены сотни испытаний. Здесь все выверено, отработано, испытано, подписана техническая документация, которая...
Сделано все, что зависело от людей. Старт назначен на 15 ноября в 6 часов утра по московскому времени. Но погода ухудшается с каждым часом, и если ветер станет шквальным, орбитальный корабль и энергия покроются коркой льда, время старта снова может измениться. Теперь погода вмешивается в летные испытания. Байконура.
Nearly 700 spotlights shone down on the Soviet shuttle as technicians made final preparations for its maiden launch. The Soviets are proud of their once secret shuttle, describing it as a giant dolphin. But this dolphin, named Buran or Snowstorm, caused major embarrassment 16 days ago when its first launch was aborted within a minute of blastoff. The problem was the service gantry arm, which failed to retract far enough from the giant booster rocket. Since then, the engineers have worked round the clock to install a redesigned gantry. Tests proved the adjustment to be reliable, and the launch was given the go-ahead. The shuttle is now being fueled with the 2,000 tons of liquid hydrogen needed for its liftoff. All being well, only weather problems could now delay the launch. The shuttle is expected to orbit the Earth twice on fully automatic control before touching down on a concrete runway a few miles from the launch site.
Сегодня, 15 ноября, особый день для многострадального народа Палестины. Сегодня с рассветом стала реальностью независимая Палестина. Решение об этом принято на чрезвычайной сессии в Алжире Национального совета Палестины, высшего законодательного органа палестинского народа. Народа, восставшего против оккупации. Восстание, интифада на оккупированных Израилем землях идет уже 12-й месяц. Сессия палестинского парламента в изгнании утвердила политическое заявление. Она полностью поддержала художника.
Только что мы получили сообщение ТАСС, которое наверняка все ждут с нетерпением. 15 ноября 1988 года в 6 часов московского времени в Советском Союзе осуществлен старт универсальной ракетно-космической транспортной системы «Энергия» с кораблем многоразового использования «Буран». В 6 часов 47 минут орбитальный корабль вышел на расчетную орбиту. Программой испытаний предусмотрен двухвитковый полет орбитального корабля вокруг Земли и посадка его в автоматическом режиме на космодроме Байконур в 9 часов 25 минут московского времени. Наш корреспондент передает из Центра управления полетом.
Внимание! Получен доклад руководителя группы анализа. По данным плавучих станций слежения, маршал Неделин и космонавт Добровольский, двигатель орбитального маневрирования корабля при выполнении второго маневра до выведения отработал 42 секунды, что соответствует штатному времени работы двигателя.
Орбитальный корабль «Буран» вышел на дежурную орбиту, на ту орбиту, по которой он должен совершить двухвитковый полет, который предусматривает это летно-конструкторские испытания. Вот этим моментом, вот в этот момент закончился этап введения корабля на орбиту, состоящий из двух на этот раз. Это необычная программа, мы о таком еще вам не рассказывали. Первое – это выведение корабля с помощью ракетоносителя «Энергия». Две ступени работают. Первый блок и второй центральный блок. И точно по программе, точно по штатной программе, заложенной в машину, произошло разделение ступеней. Орбитальный корабль отделился от ракетоносителя и пошел подниматься до орбиты, на которой он находится сейчас. Только в этот момент включаются его собственные двигатели на двухимпульсный маневр. Двигатели орбитального маневрирования. И опять же, интересная деталь. Включаются не сразу двигатели, а прежде включаются система обеспечения их запуска. И уже в космосе эта высота от 150 км до 250, это уже космос, за пределами земной атмосферы, создается искусственная тяжесть двигателей, чтобы разделить топливо и газ. Таким образом работают двигатели орбитального корабля «Буран».
The Soviet space shuttle Buran is in orbit right now. Soviet media report the unmanned flight lifted off right on schedule, 10 o'clock Eastern Time.
Later than originally planned, but went smoothly according to Soviet news reports. The Soviet shuttle was pushed into Earth orbit at an altitude of 150 miles about 47 minutes after launch. The Soviet media said the craft would circle the globe twice in its unmanned flight, which will last about 3 hours, 25 minutes. The TASS news agency said when the craft touches down, it will be traveling 204 miles per hour, about the same landing speed as a jet fighter. The computer-driven flight will end on a special landing strip about 8 miles away from the liftoff at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Soviet Kazakhstan. Patrick?
All right, Steve. Now, can you maybe tell us why? My understanding, if my memory serves here, they were going to first orbit the first time. They were set for 4 orbits, I believe, and now they've cut it down. Is there any reason for that?
No, I don't think, Patrick, they've cut it down. The first launch, which was scheduled for October 29th, was scrubbed 51 seconds before liftoff when something went wrong. The ground support system didn't pull back properly. At least the computer thought so. But at that time, I think there were 2 or 3 orbits planned, not 4. They're now saying that these 2 orbits will be fully sufficient to test the system in advance of a planned manned launch, which is not so far scheduled.
Well, that was going to be my next question to you. How much testing would they have to do you think, Steve, before they would send some cosmonauts up?
I think that, Donna, they are looking to make sure that the Energia booster rocket would carry this thing aloft the way they wanted it. They apparently had a perfect launch and put it into orbit exactly as planned. I think that having happened, and if all onboard systems work the way they think they're going to work, that we'll probably see a manned flight of the Buran, which means snowstorm in Russian, very soon.
All right, thanks very much. Steve Hurst in Moscow.
Just moments ago, the shuttle landed miles from the spot where it took off in Baikonur in Soviet Central Asia. The unmanned shuttle went into space about 3.5 hours ago. It completed 2 full orbits before returning to Earth. The launch and landing was not shown live on Soviet television. Instead, viewers saw the liftoff about an hour and a half later. This was the second attempt to launch the shuttle. A previous liftoff was scrubbed just seconds before blastoff 2 weeks ago because of technical problems. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev,
standing for snowstorm, has landed after a 2-orbit maiden flight. It took off 3.5 hours ago from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Soviet Central Asia. It has now glided after 2 orbits of the Earth to a computer-controlled touchdown on a concrete runway at the Cosmodrome, where it lifted off 3.5 hours earlier. It took off despite heavy rains and high winds. The liftoff is the Soviet Union's first shuttle launch. The first attempt to launch Buran nearly 2 weeks ago failed after an equipment malfunction. In the United States,
down in Soviet Central Asia Tuesday morning after a flight of 3.5 hours. TASS says the shuttle named Buran, or Snowstorm, completed 2 orbits before the computer-controlled landing. Soviet TV said all systems worked properly during the flight. Police in Sacramento...
The smile on the Soviet television announcer's face meant this time the news was good. The countdown for the launch of the first Soviet space shuttle went flawlessly, and Buran, or Snowstorm as it's called, lifted off with the help of the world's largest rocket booster, Energia. No cosmonauts were aboard. This flight was all controlled from the Baikonur Space Center. From there, Soviet engineers watched as their shuttle flew 2 orbits of the Earth. Computers then Space Center. From there, Soviet engineers watched their shuttle flew 2 orbits of the Earth. Computers then issued commands to the shuttle's automatic pilot, and Buran began its re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. At first, it was just a speck against the clouds, but then came these pictures, again reminding viewers of how closely the Soviet shuttle resembles its American counterpart, from which it appears to have been copied. The automated approach of Buran to the landing strip came 3 hours and 25 minutes later, the shuttle touching down just a few miles from where it had lifted off. And the landing was as perfect as the liftoff. The shuttle's white fuselage was now almost gray from heat generated during re-entry. 3 parachutes helped slow the shuttle to the end of a safe and successful maiden flight. Walter Rogers, ABC News, Moscow.
Держать в кадре. А это еще говорит о том, что все иноземные службы работают четко. Сопровождение вошли в облачность. Касание. Можно остановиться как раз напротив нашего командного пункта. Тормозные парашюты выпущены. Отстрел парашютов и остановка.
Practically, it's the same. It's the only vehicle that can do that job.
The Soviet shuttle, like the Americans, will act as a delivery truck. The difference is that Buran has somewhere to take its load. It'll ferry cosmonauts and payloads to Mir and back. The Americans don't yet have a space station. It's still on the drawing board. At present, the shuttle can't dock with the space station, but a new airlock module should soon be attached. Then they'll be able to make regular trips to Mir, carrying equipment to be assembled on board. The next flight is expected in the middle of next year, this time with cosmonauts at the controls. That'll be the real test. If it works, they'll begin launching the building blocks of a spaceship that will one day take them to Mars.
Space shuttle launches into orbit. A Soviet space shuttle launches into orbit.
Reindeer touchdown.
An American space shuttle glides in for a landing. A Russian space shuttle glides in for a landing. The similarities are striking.
But at least one expert on the Soviet space program says it would be dangerous and naive to think that the similarities are any more than skin deep.
James Oak has studied and written about the Soviet program for years.
Back. They have just dashed into the last sandbox, last monopoly that America has had in space. They've matched us in every area of space technology now.
That is not something Oberg says lightly. While many Eastern observers have believed the Soviets are incapable of flying a shuttle without stealing the technology from the West, Oberg says they made great strides.
The only thing similar is the silhouette. The rest of the hardware, the crew systems, the propulsion, as I was saying, the flight control, the computers, and the software are all homegrown.
Oberg says the Soviets may really use their shuttle for years. They have plenty of space capsules and rockets, which work just fine. But the Soviet shuttle helps them learn other technologies involved in very fast airplanes and cruise missiles, and eliminates the last area of exclusively American capabilities. The Soviet shuttle is called Buran, Russian for snowstorm.
Buran, it means snowstorm, a blizzard. It means Sputnik. It means here's a lesson for the administration. We can own no monopoly on any type of technology.
The Soviets have not said when Buran will fly in.
Despite earlier heavy rain and high winds at the Baikonur Cosmodrome launch site, a new Energia booster sent the unmanned shuttle off the launch pad on schedule at 6 a.m. Moscow time Tuesday. The Soviet news agency TASS said the shuttle separated on schedule from its booster rocket and then completed 2 Earth orbits as planned.